we're still decked out, and it's still Christmas here. So, Merry Christmas. I showed up this morning, and I came in, and it had felt like it had been like a month since I've been here, and I was here last week. But it feels like it was so long ago, because I don't know about you, but the last week for me was incredibly busy. Of course, I traveled for the holidays, which I imagine some of you did. And if you weren't traveling, you probably had people travel to you. And it just seemed to make for a very long week. And so here we are. So I feel like in a week's time, we did about a month's worth of activity. And of course, I'm sure all of you went to places where you opened presents, and probably opened presents at multiple places like myself. And I hope you guys got lots of wonderful things. But then there's always those gifts you return. You know, there's always those gifts you open up and you're like, maybe not so much. Sometimes they just don't work. Sometimes they aren't your size. Sometimes you just don't like them and they have to go back. And my boyfriend, Evan, this year got a rack for his sink, which is granted not the most exciting Christmas gift to receive, but it's useful. And he got it, and we were excited. He was excited about it, and we went to go put it in his sink, and lo and behold, it doesn't fit. It wasn't made for his sink. So away it goes, return to sender. He can't use it. It doesn't fit the sink. And so we get those Christmas presents that have to be returned. And they're usually Christmas presents we don't want, usually because they don't work. I think it'd be a very different thing to have to return something that you did very much want. Something that you got, and you really liked, and you needed, and then you had to give it back. I don't think any of us have really experienced that during Christmas time. We keep the things that we want. But I mention it because there's an Old Testament story about a woman named Hannah. She's the mother of Samuel. Samuel was a great prophet who actually anointed David, who had to give something back which she wanted for a very long time. Hannah had a lot of trouble having Samuel. She'd been trying for a long time. She was in a polygamous marriage, so her husband had 2 wives, and the other wife had all these children, and Hannah had none. And there's this wonderful story of a family going up to Shiloh, and Hannah is just beside herself because the other wife is kind of rubbing it in her face that she has all these children and Hannah doesn't have any. And we see Hannah just crying out to God to just take away her barrenness and so she can have a child. And God grants her plea, and she has Samuel. Now what does she do? She gives him back to the Lord. She waits until Samuel is weaned, which some people say he was about 3 years old when he was weaned. And then she brings him up to Shiloh, and she leaves him actually with the prophet Eli. And that's a hard thing. He was 3 years old. Could you imagine taking your 3-year-old child away from home and leaving him somewhere? And we know that she would go back every year to visit him for the same festival and bring him a little ephod or like a little robe to serve the Lord. Just, you know how kids grow, so every year she'd bring him one that was a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger. But he grew up in the Lord's house. He grew up at Shiloh before the Lord. And wow, she knew that the Lord had given her Samuel. And here she is giving him back to the Lord. And there's this beautiful, it says in the book of Samuel, after when she comes to give Samuel back to the Lord, when she comes to consecrate him as actually a Nazarite. Nazarites were consecrated to the Lord. She says, "For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me the petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is given to the Lord." And she left him there for the Lord. How powerful. She would go on to have other children, but Samuel would always stay in the Lord's house. he had a return to sender label, as it were. He was the gift that was hers, but the one she didn't keep. And it reminds me of the story we're going to talk about today, of Jesus' life. It's the only story we have from Jesus' childhood, but it's connected to the story of Samuel. It comes many, many years after the first Christmas. It's been 12 years. This is post-angels, post-wise men, post-shepherds, post-flight to Egypt, and Jesus is 12 years old. And the story, which is found in the Gospel of Luke, is that his family was going up to the temple for Passover. And Jesus is 12 years old. They left as a whole community probably, and they go up there and they have their festival, and then they leave, and, oh honey, I think we forgot something. Oh, that would be Jesus. I don't know if you ever left a child while you're on a family vacation, but you can imagine their panic. And at first they're not really worried because they would have traveled as a community. They think, well, maybe Jesus is just with our relatives and our friends. So you imagine them going around on the road and saying, have you seen Jesus? Oh, no, we haven't. And so they start to get pretty freaked out. They return to Jerusalem, and they don't find him on the first day or on the second day. It's on the third day that they find Jesus. And they find him, of all places, in the temple. And he's there as a 12-year-old boy, and he is listening to and asking questions from the great teachers. And there he is. And they, his mother, just anxiety racked, says, she's just freaking out. She's like, what have you done to us? Why have you done this to us? We've been looking for you. And he just says quite simply, well, why were you looking for me? Didn't you know that I'd be in my Father's house? And they're kind of dumbfounded. Like, they can't really believe it. Which struck me as kind of interesting when I realized, I'm like, have they just completely forgotten Christmas and what happened around here? But it occurs to me that this is 12 years after Christmas, the original Christmas, with the angels and the wise men and the shepherds, and the flight to Egypt, and just there were so many spectacular things that happened around that first Christmas, that, this is a child sent from God. But after that, and after the flight to Egypt and the return, Jesus was one of the most domesticated miracles that ever happened. We see him at 12 as kind of one of the clan. He grew up. He had other brothers and sisters. According to the Bible, he was the first of a family, so there was other children. And it strikes me that Mary and Joseph were very used to Jesus just being around. He was part of their family. In the story, Mary's like, son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. There's no one who knows better than Mary that Joseph is most certainly not Jesus' father. But you have to picture, this has been 12 years later, Joseph would have acted like Jesus' father. They would have done whatever the first century equivalent of, learning how to catch a baseball. Joseph would have spent a lot of time with Jesus. He was Jesus' father. He would have taught him how to do some of the carpentry skills, which were Joseph's. And they were pretty used to Jesus. Jesus was pretty domesticated. And Jesus is doing a really good job as God of passing as a person. And that would be because he was. He was fully human. And as God, he was the most human that's ever been a human before. And that's kind of cool. We're made in the image of God. And Jesus is God. He was the most fully human person that's ever walked the face of the earth. He was doing a great job. We thought he was one of us. Even his own family, who knew his miraculous origins, he was the boy next door. He was one of us. They looked for him among their friends and relatives because he belonged to them. He was one of their relations. That's why they looked for him there. But where do they find him? They find him in the temple. Now it's interesting that they find him in the temple. The temple in the Old Testament is a symbol of God dwelling among his people. It's where God is. It's a symbol of God being among the Israelite people. And that's where we find Jesus. In our gospel reading this morning, we know that it's Jesus who is the epitome of God dwelling among us. He's what the temple symbolized. But the fullness of God dwelling in with us comes with Christ. Christ is, in essence, the temple. And so we see him at the temple as a child, and an exceptional child he is. Where he belongs. Doing, learning and asking questions. And so we see him as God, even at 12 years old. And, as a Christmas carol goes, Lord at his birth. He's every bit God and Lord as a 12-year-old that he was as a man. And so we see him there, and his parents just don't know what to do with it. They were astonished. They're just shocked. And you probably heard it recently, that song, Mary, Did You Know? Okay, guys, Mary didn't know. Nobody gave her a blueprint of the New Testament and said, look, this is exactly what is going to happen. She had a better idea than most. She didn't know. I don't think anybody got the full import of Jesus being on earth until after the ascension, really, is when I think the full impact of what Jesus had really meant to us happened. But you can imagine his parents are just anxious to find him and to get him back. And so here he is at the temple, and kind of revealing himself as God. And then what happens? I think that the important part is what happens afterwards. Unlike Samuel, who goes to the temple and stays at the temple, it's written of Jesus, then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother kept all these things in her heart, and Jesus increased in wisdom and stature in the favor of God and people. Jesus goes home. He goes back to Nazareth. That's a happier ending for us than Samuel's story. He goes back with his parents. He goes back home. Or does he? Or does he? Or rather, if you think about the story of Samuel, could be said that God the Father left him there with his family. He left him there with us. God gave us his Son to be part of our family so that we could be part of his family. So God the Father, like Hannah, left his Son. Not left him, he never abandoned him. But he let him be with us in that same way. And ours in an interesting way, because of course Jesus does go back to the Father. He's still a Christmas present with a return to Cinder label. But he brings us with him. He brings us with him back to God. And I think that we, like Jesus, or like Jesus' family, can get really used to Jesus just being around. We go to church, we go to our Bible studies, we read the Bible, we heard the same scripture preached so many times. We become really familiar with him, a lot like Jesus' family. We just get used to God being around. But then sometimes God does something to shake us up. Sometimes God does things that let us know, look, I'm God. Yes, I'm around. I'm God. And so as I reflect on this passage, I think that there's two things I can say for us. And that one is that we should be very familiar with Christ. He should be part of our lives. He should be an everyday part of our lives. I encourage you to meditate on his word in the morning and the evening, at noontime. I encourage you to pray as readily as you breathe. He should be an everyday part of your life, just like he was for Mary and Joseph. But second is, don't forget he's God. He's awesome. Be open to him doing unexpected things. Don't let familiarity breed contempt. He is God. And I encourage you to, this season, let him be God dwelling with us. Amen.